Michael? So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for webinar number 4 in a series of 6 webinars, which are designed to support participants in Samsung's Solve for Tomorrow competition. My name is Julie Baker. I'm the Education Manager at Auckland's MOTAT and one of the judges for the Solve for Tomorrow competition. And also with us today is Sarah Washbrook from TENZ, who is a competition judge also, and Michael Grimmer, a lead educator here at MOTAT. We're going to record this webinar and it will be posted onto the Samsung and TENZ website for future reference for you. Just starting with a whakatauki. This whakatauki has been chosen because it's appropriate for today's topic, which is on prototyping. So, I orea te tuatara ka puta ki waho. A problem is solved by continuing to find solutions. A quick review of the competition timeline. You'll see that we have passed the period in which you could submit a project plan for judges' feedback. That has been completed, that process, and the feedback was posted out earlier this week for those who submitted. So now we're working towards the closing date of the competition, which is the 4th of September. It leaves us a little over 6 weeks to complete your projects. Webinar 2 focused on finding a problem, empathizing and defining your problem in this part of the design thinking process. And webinar 3 looked at ideating and developing a concept. So today we're going to go on to this section here, which is around prototyping. We'll talk about the difference between modeling and prototyping, and we'll discuss why prototyping should be a part of your process, what the purpose of prototyping is, and what to do with the outcomes. Lastly, we'll look at the competition scoring matrix and see where prototyping fits in, and you'll be able to see the relative importance that's placed on this part of your project. So what is a prototype again? Sometimes there's confusion about the difference between a model and a prototype. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time clarifying those two things for you. You, at the beginning of your process, will have started with a problem and you will have identified some solutions for that problem. And at this point in your process, the ideas were probably really wild and loose. There might be some really extravagant things. They wouldn't have been fully formed. Some of them might not even be feasible or even achievable. So you would have gone through a process of ruling out your wilder ideas and being able to focus then on the best solution. So the one that you think might have the best answer to your initial problem that you conceive. You might then develop that idea more fully and create a concept. So here's an example of a concept that has been worked on by another group. It's, as you can see, a piece of paper pretty much, and it's just a big dump of ideas. It's got lots of diagrams on it, it's got notes on it. You can see that there are different ideas that are kind of all jumbled in together. They haven't decided on anything particularly strongly at this point. They're really just kind of gathering all their thoughts together and capturing them and making notes of them so that they're then able to stand back and take a bit of a bigger picture and consider them. You see, there's lots and lots of unknowns there. You might be considering how your product what shape it might be, or what form it might take, what color it might be, what materials you might be using. And you might be considering a little bit about how your product might work, what its function is. You capture all of those possibilities and you go through a bit of a selection process and you identify a smaller number of ideas to develop further. And then we move on to the next stage, which may be that you choose to model a couple of those selected ideas. Doesn't have to be one idea that you work with. You may at this point still have a couple of ideas in your head and you develop a model for them. Now, a model doesn't have to be fully functional. It doesn't have to be a working thing. It's just a way of kind of lifting those ideas off the paper so you can start to consider some of the other aspects of it, like the real size of it, the actual shape of it, the color of it, the material that you might be using, and how it might work. As a general rule, a model tends to focus more on form, it's the way it looks, rather than its function, the way it works. You may find that your model is a useful tool to help explain your concept to others. So when you go out there and you're talking to maybe some stakeholders or some users, potential users, you may take a model with you and say, hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking of it. It's not going to look exactly like this, but this is sort of communicating the idea to you. Richmond Road School, Special School, were prize winners in 2022 with their project to develop a kitchen knife which could be safely used by classmates who had physical disabilities and or visual impairment. And this last picture here, or sorry, these two pictures here, are both from their project submission. So if we look at the this page here that they've submitted, it looks, you can see some of the models that they have created for their project. They have decided that they would look at three different ideas here. One is a hinged knife. You can see there's a bit of a hinge happening here with a blade. And then another one looks a bit like a sort of mezzaluna kind of knife blade, which you rock backwards and forwards. And then this last one here, which quite honestly, I don't quite know how that functions, but it's obviously an idea that they were considering earlier in their process, and they've discarded it along the way. You can also see that they've created here some models from modelling clay. And they're pretty rough and dirty when you look at them. They're pretty rough shapes, but they would have been using those to get some ideas of things like, you know, how long does the handle have to be for you to be able to hold it nice and clearly? What is the design, the shape of the blade going to look like? Just some kind of early ideas of how those things might look. You'll see also the models of being constructed out of clay. Now, obviously, this illustrates the idea that we're not looking at a fully functioning thing here. We're just looking at a bit of a mock-up of it. So it goes to this definition here. A model is a non-working representation used to explain the product. And they will go through a similar kind of process where they looked at all of their different models and they thought to themselves, well, you know, I'm not sure about this one. I don't think it's really going to go anywhere. This one's got some merit, but you know, maybe we're not going to develop that one further, and maybe we'll develop this one here, which is the hinged knife. And they will then take that idea through into potentially a prototyping, developing a prototype of that particular idea. Which moves us on to this last slide here. The prototype is developed when you have a pretty clear idea of what you're going to build, and you're interested in seeing in more detail how that product is going to work. It's more about the function of the product. It's a working representation. So the definition up here, prototype is a working representation used to detect flaws or problems before you start producing the thing. You can see here with the Richmond Road Special School, they selected the hinged knife as the one that they were going to develop into the prototype stage. And they have made little notes and annotations on here. So here's this thing here. The blade needs to be removable for easy cleaning. So they've looked at the function of the model and the prototype, and they've thought, well, you know, it's all very well having this hinged knife, but actually we're going to have to clean that blade. So we'll have to have it so that you can take the blade out and be able to wash the blade and then put it back in safely so it's in a usable state again. So it's an actual product, or an actual shaped item that they have built, and they're doing some testing about, you know, how is this actually going to work and perform the job that we're wanting it to perform. So at this point, they'd also be going back to their original problem and checking in that their prototype is actually answering the needs that have been stated in their original problem and their concept. One of the things that you do with a prototype is test it. You use it for testing with your stakeholder groups. You get as many people as possible to have a go with your product, and you get their feedback. And their feedback might be verbal, it might be surveys, it might be answering a questionnaire, it might be just you videoing them using the object so you can go and look at it later and think to yourself, well, I can see that that's a bit uncomfortable to hold, or I can see that it's not quite, you know, working the way that we're intending it to work. So feedback can be gathered in all sorts of different ways. And you use that feedback that you have gathered to make changes in your design. So might be simple things. It might be just little tweaks to that prototype that you've built. It might be just that you make the handle a bit longer, or you bend it slightly more in this direction, or you change the shape of it in some small way. It could be also that you're making a major change. You may make the decision that your product as you have designed it doesn't work. It's not meeting the need, or it's unusable, or is not an adequate solution in some other way. And in which case it may mean that you abandon that and you go right back to, say, your ideation stage and have a look at some of those other ideas and maybe develop those ones and bring those ones forward. Testing and redesigning the product like this is called design iterations. And the program, this diagram that we've got here with the design process actually illustrates that by these arrows at the top here. So, we were at the prototyping stage. Sometimes the results of our prototyping might mean that we have to go back to our ideating stage. It might mean that we have to go right the way back to empathizing and start the whole process again. For example, we thought that a hinged knife might solve the problem, but actually after we've done some prototyping and testing, we found that hinged knife is not the right way to do it because people are scared of knives, so that's not an adequate solution. So we have to find some other way to solve our problem. So the idea of this is that you kind of are moving backwards and forwards through this process and refining, redeveloping your design as you go along, as you get that feedback and as you do that testing. Just a comment on the design process. We're using this graphic to illustrate a design process. Just want to recognise that there is no one design process, that this is a huge simplification of a quite messy and dynamic process. Looking at this, you'd be convinced that designers work from one step to another in a very nice, clean, logical way. And in reality, if you actually recorded your own design process graphically, it would probably look something a bit more messy and a bit more like this. So what are the judges looking for? And where does prototyping fit into the scoring matrix that we use to judge your products and your presentations? It fits in two sections. It fits into this relevance section at the top here, and it fits into the STEAM section at the bottom here. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the next slide. But before we leave the slide, I just want to point out here that there is a code for you to be able to find the full assessment criteria, the scoring matrix that we use on the Samsung website. And I highly recommend that you go and have a little look at that in detail, because it will give you some really good insight into what sort of things the judges are looking for, and the relative weightings of things that need to be present in your presentation of your process to us. So back to where does prototyping fit in? The first part it fits into is in relevance. And what we're looking for on this matrix here, you've got the lower marks at the bottom, a 1, and at the top it goes up to a 5, and it's a graduation of comments all the way up that we are trying to marry your work up with. So the highest scoring here is that the solution has been significantly improved via repeated testing and iteration. So what we are looking for, we're looking for evidence that you have done some testing and that you have used the results of your testing to change your designs in some way for the better, to improve your designs. And hopefully you may have been able to do that more than once. You may have gone through a couple of iterations of it. It shows us that you've taken your product out to your users and that you've given them the opportunity to give you feedback on how relevant and useful it is to them. That's why it sits under the relevance criteria. The second place it crops up is in the STEAM section, and it's where we are looking at whether you have used a design process or a scientific process and that it is evident and documented in your presentation. So the steps that we look for in that design process, we're trying to see that presented to us. And just on that thought around what is evidence? Evidence includes things like, for example, questionnaires or surveys or pictures or videos. Just a little bit of a heads up, as a judge, it's a lot easier to get a good sense of your process through pictures and videos than it is through a long wordy document that you might have written up. So my personal favourite would be to go to more of a pictorial or a graphical kind of presentation than a text-based one. Just wanted to pause there and ask if there were any questions, but we will move on through. So the next slide, there are a lot of resources available for you to support you in your process of putting together a project, working through a project, and then presenting the project at the end. So wanting to point you at the Samsung Solve for Tomorrow website, there is a link here for them, and each of these link through to different resources that have been kindly developed by TENZ and posted up on the website for everyone to use. You'll see that we are pretty much working down towards these last two at this point in time. And so next webinar, we'll be talking about testing and evaluating a prototype. And then lastly, just a recognition that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted up on the Samsung Solve for Tomorrow website and the TENZ YouTube channel, and that for those of you who would like to download your own copy of this webinar, there is a bit.ly code here that you can scan and download. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you for joining us, and we hope that we see you at our next webinar.